Today we will be looking to the bones which comprise together to form the skull. Okay, so as you know that the skull basically is made up of 28 bones in total. Okay, so in total 28 bones are responsible for the formation of a skull, out of which 14 bones are going to form the cranial skeleton and the rest 14 are going to form the facial skeleton. Now when you see these bones, the first what we are deciding here or reading here is the cranial skeleton. So if you see this particular skull, this particular picture, you will see that the skull altogether is being divided into two components, the cranial component as well as the facial component. Both the components have got 14 bones. So if you transversely divide this from here, you will see this area is your cranial component and this is the facial component. First we will be looking to the cranial component. Now coming to the bones in total which are seen in this part, you could see the frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, temporal bone, sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. All these bones together they come to be the cranial component of the skull. Now looking to which are the paired structures and which are the unpaired structures. For example, if you see the frontal bone, this is a unpaired structure. You can see in this particular image also, this is your frontal bone and this frontal bone is basically unpaired structure. Okay, so this is the unpaired structure. If you see here, this here, the forehead which is forming your forehead, this is your frontal bone. Okay, posterior to the frontal bone you have got the parietal bone. Now you see here in this picture, parietal bone are always two in number. One is going to be the right side parietal bone, another one is the left side parietal bone. So we can say that parietal bone is basically a paired bone. Coming to the next one, that is the occipital. So this bone here is said to be your occipital bone. This is also said to be the base of the skull. And this is a single bone. Okay, here also you can see this is one single bone. So your occipital is going to be a unpaired bone. You need to remember this. This is like basic. Okay, coming to the temporal bone, see near your ear here you have your temporal bone. It is somewhere near your ear region and it is going to be on both the sides. So again it is a paired bone. Now coming to the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. See, ethmoid bone and sphenoid bone are very difficult to see like this. If you see this particular structure here, this is your sphenoid bone. It is just near this junction of frontal, parietal and temporal. So you can say just after the orbit and near the temporal region. This is your sphenoid bone. Ethmoid cannot be seen or appreciated through this structure, but definitely we would be putting a picture for that also. Okay, so your sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone are also going to be again sphenoid both the sides, so it is going to be a paired structure. Similarly ethmoid also is going to be a paired structure. So now you know that what are the total parts or different bones which comprise to form the cranial component of the skull and are they a paired or a unpaired structure. Okay, this was the basic. Now just to give it a quick revision, this is the frontal part, parietal part, temporal part, occipital part, sphenoidal part, sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. Now coming to the different sutures which we see in the cranial component. Okay, in the skull only, in the cranial component there are certain sutures. These are basically, you can say, junctions where two bones are going to meet or fuse. Okay, so basically the more important of the three sutures are your coronal suture, sagittal suture and the lambdoid suture. Now which one is the coronal suture? This is your frontal bone, this is your parietal bone, this is the occipital bone. So which particular is the coronal suture? It is a suture that is seen at the site of junction of fusion of the frontal bone to the right and left of the parietal bone. Okay, so this is your coronal suture. If I have to mark it, this is the coronal suture. It is basically seen in between of the frontal bone and the parietal bone. Next coming to the sagittal suture. Now this here is your sagittal suture. Again it could be seen at the junction or in between of the two parietal bones. Okay, now this here is your lambdoid suture. Lambdoid suture basically is seen between the occipital bone as well as your parietal bone. Okay, so these are the three particular sutures and now you know where they are seen or what are the different bones in between they are seen. Okay, this is the parietal foramen. So in between, or you can say on both sides of the sagittal suture, on the parietal bone region, you can see small foramens which are said to be the parietal foramen. Now there is a site which is seen in the center, okay? In the center of the skull there is a site which is seen. I want you all to write the name of this particular site, okay? I want you to write the name of this particular site. If you know, please write it down in the comment box, otherwise I will write it, okay? Now coming to the next structure, when we talk about the cranial component, what all we have discussed? We have discussed the bone which are involved, we have discussed the different type of sutures which are seen. The next thing which we are going to talk about is bragma. See, when we talk about bragma and lambda, so what are these bragma and lambda? They are basically frontanels. Okay, these are basically what? Frontanels. Now what is basically frontanel? See, when a child is small, when there is a fetal skull, when you talk about a fetal skull, no ossification has taken place. At that time what happens is, at this junction of the three bones, no, at this junction area, the bone is missing. So the bone here is missing from these sides. The ossification has not taken place, and so these structures are usually seen in a fetal skull, not in an adult skull. It is seen in a fetal skull. Now what do you mean by bragma here? The first one, the one which we are seeing here, no, in between of the frontal bone and the parietal bone at the site of coronal suture, this is said to be your bragma frontanel, okay? So this is said to be bragma or the anterior frontanel. It means that there is gaps and gaps with no bones. As I told you, that ossification hasn't taken place yet, so there is going to be gap here. Now here in the posterior region, similarly in between of your parietal and the occipital bone, on your lambdoid suture region, there is going to be another frontanel, and this is said to be lambda or the posterior frontanel. So two frontanels are very clear till now. One is bragma, another one is lambdoid, okay? Other to your bragma and lambdoid, there are going to be certain posterior frontanels also, the lateral frontanels, okay? Anterolateral and the posterolateral. See, this is your, and as I'm saying, anterolateral. So this is lateral and also anterior. So this is the anterolateral frontanels on each side of lateral side of the skull, and this is going to be the posterolateral. Okay, so in total we are talking about 4 frontanels right now. First is bragma, then we have lambdoid, then we have anterolateral, and then we have the posterolateral. Okay, so let's first look towards what is bragma and what is your lambdoid, the difference between these two. See, bragma is going to be bigger and more important. As you see, it is bigger in size, so definitely it is going to be more important. Whereas lambdoid, or the lambda is going to be smaller, as well as it is going to be comparatively less important. It's not that it's not important, but comparatively it's less important. Now bragma, again, it is going to be present between the parietal and frontal bone. I've just made you see that. Now the lambda here is seen between the parietal bone and the occipital bone. These structures I hope are very clear to you. This is occipital, parietal and frontal, okay? So lambda is basically seen between parietal and the occipital. Next, it is present between the coronal and the sagittal suture. If we talk about bragma, this is the coronal suture, this is the sagittal suture, so it is present in between or at the junction of both of them, whereas the lambda is present between the sagittal and lambdoid suture. Now, what is the particular age of this particular bragma and lambda? At what particular age it ossifies? So see, this bragma here is the last one to close, or you can say this is basically known as frontanel closing or closing of frontanel, okay? And also you can understand this by a very easy term, that is ossification. So the ossification here basically occurs by the age of 18 to 24 months, and so this is the last frontanel to ossify, whereas your lambda here is going to ossify by the age of 2 to 3 months, okay? If you see the shape of your bragma, very important, it is diamond shaped structure, whereas if you see the structure or shape of your lambda, it is going to be triangular in shape. Now, as I've told you that other than this, there are going to be 2 other frontanels. You can say them to be the accessory frontanels, okay? These are not that important. So these are the accessory frontanels, and this is the anterolateral and your posterolateral one. The anterolateral one here could be said as sphenoidal, and the posterolateral one could be said as a mastoid frontal. Okay, so these are basically the structures of your anterolateral and the posterolateral. This here is your bragma and this here is your lambda. So this was all about the cranial component of skull. In the next video we will be talking about the facial skeleton or facial part of the skull.